Welcome back to the Casual Combat MMA podcast. I'm your host, Nelson Baker, and different than most episodes, my co-host, Cal Gerber, is unable to attend. He is out at the Super 32 coaching his brother. It is a national wrestling tournament out in North Carolina, I believe. So instead of Cal, we have a co-host here today who is actually my brother. He is much like Cal and I don't think we've ever talked about this on the podcast, but we're all two-time state champs. Nolan is also an undefeated two-time state champ, a Division I wrestler, now lives out at the Olympic Training Center. So he is a very accomplished combat athlete in his own right. And he also is, truth be told, the one that kind of introduced me to combat sports in general. So without further ado, Nolan, how you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I, just like you, I'm a casual fan, not qualified at all to talk about any of this stuff. But as a fan of MMA, I feel like anybody's opinion is, warranted because, it is a business. So I'm happy to get on here and talk about the fights.
Awesome. And I will have to apologize to our listeners who are listening on the podcast version of this episode. If you can't see our faces, we've been told by many people that our voices are almost indistinguishable from each other. So it may be a little bit hard to keep track of who's talking if you can't see our faces, but I'll just use this as a plug to go subscribe to us on our YouTube channel at Casual Combat MMA. So let's get right into it. I know you and I watched the UFC 254 fights yesterday with each other, and I think there's not too much to recap. I think everybody that is in the world of MMA probably has already seen the fights or heard about the fights, but let's just do a quick recap. First off, let's talk about Whittaker versus Cannonier. I know on our last episode, Cal and I talked about how for some reason, everybody was kind of jumping on the Cannonier bandwagon. And in my eyes, I mean, there has been absolutely no evidence that would lead Cannonier to being a favorite or to having a way that he was going to beat Whittaker. And that's kind of what we saw. What was your take on the fight?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, going into the fight, I wasn't entirely familiar with Cannonier. I obviously knew of his fights in the past, but that was the first time I've ever seen Cannonier fought. I think after the fight, it's definitely, the respect for Cannonier was definitely warranted. It didn't look like he was outclassed by any means. I think all the hype going into it was truly just the creation of the Izzy call-out. I think Izzy, masterfully on the mic created an enemy in Cannonier or, somebody that people could get behind and root for. So I think a lot of the people, like myself included, that thought Cannonier was going to go in there. Well, I didn't think he was going to smoke Whittaker, but I thought there was a good possibility he could go in there and dominate him. That was truly just off the voice of Izzy. So I think everybody just holds Izzy in such high regard that when Izzy says somebody's the guy, then everybody's like, okay, that's the guy.
Yeah.
But then I think obviously we saw the, Robert Whittaker come out and show why he was such a dominant champ for so long.
Absolutely. I think, I know that Izzy said this at his last post-fight interview, but he said y'all must have forgot. But I feel like everybody forgot about all of Whittaker's accomplishments and the fact that he really only lost one fight in the last 10 years, and it was to Izzy, who's beaten everybody. And I think that now this solidifies Whittaker, obviously, as the number one contender. In my mind, he was never not the number one contender. I think the UFC has just done a great job of building up their top middleweights. I think, they did a great job of building up Costa, who helped himself by having an undefeated record and having some big wins. They've got Yoel Romero. They've got Whittaker. They've got, a few other guys in there that are real title contenders and are also known and promoted as such. So, yeah,
I think what's interesting about that division too is if you would have asked me half a year to a year ago, I'd say that is the most exciting division in the UFC. And now, not that, anytime Izzy fights, I'm going to be super excited to see it. And like Whittaker said in his post-fight interview last night, that division really is the perfect combination of power and speed. They're significantly more powerful than 170-pounders or 155-pounders, but they still have the speed that a lot of, light heavyweights or heavyweights have. So that division is always going to be exciting for me to watch. But at the same time, I think Izzy has kind of wiped out the field in terms of who you are excited to see next. I think it's kind of like the John Jones effect, but really expedited just because Izzy has so much hype behind him.
Yeah.
So I agree. I'm like I would be very excited to see Whittaker get a rematch. But at the same time, like when you think of who else would get it besides Whittaker, you have like I think they've kind of cannibalized each other, all the contenders more or less. Like Costa, nobody's interested in getting an immediate rematch. Romero, with whatever his performance was last time, it was a bold strategy, but that definitely doesn't warrant a rematch.
Yep.
Till, they were pushing for a rematch if he beats Hermanson, and yet Till just lost to Whittaker, so it would be almost impossible to sell a Till title shot before Whittaker gets a title shot.
Yeah.
And yeah, like just like what you're saying, Whittaker, to his credit, was a super, dominant champion and was like got to be in the top 5 of pound for pound, at least in their rankings. Was at his height, and all the guys that he's beaten are the same guys that Adesanya's beaten, with the exception of Costa.
Yeah.
So as much as it's maybe not the most exciting thing, I think this is one of the instances when, as much as you want underdogs to come up and get a title shot, it's really impossible for anybody to get a title shot besides Whittaker right now.
Yeah. And on the channel here, we're going to start experimenting with a little bit of a different video format on YouTube. So I have slated for us later today to come out as its own video about the state of the 185-pound division, where we'll talk a little bit more at, what is realistic, what's exciting, what's competitive, and what's right for the division. So I'll leave that kind of for that video. But the second fight I want to talk about, obviously, is the Khabib versus Gaethje fight. I think that although Gaethje was Khabib's quickest dispatch in recent memory, as far as his title defenses go, meaning that he got rid of Gaethje as quick as he really has ever gotten rid of anybody, I think that Gaethje did a few very good things. I think both judges, or 2 of the 3 judges, gave the first round to Justin over Khabib, but I think it was still very obvious that Khabib is, in my mind, the greatest fighter that has ever stepped into the octagon and is leaving on top, and the gap between him and everyone else is just so high, And I, on my last podcast too, I said that it is kind of a pet peeve to me when a champ as dominant as, say, Izzy or Khabib or John Jones, that every time there is a challenger, everybody gets in their mind that like somehow the challenger is the one to beat him. Like there was no one that was ever close to Khabib. There was never one realistic argument that you could have made about anybody that he faced that would have given them a realistic chance, outside of people just being biased and either not liking Khabib or being such big fans of each title challenger, in my mind.
Yeah, like I think it's weird for me because Khabib is obviously such a dominant champ. Like in my mind, well, he's the GOAT to me just because I didn't get involved in MMA at the height of George St. Pierre. So George St. Pierre could have very well been just as dominant, but without like living through that period, I can't like really compare him. But in my mind, like you said, Justin Gaethje, while he might have been the quickest like disposal, or he got rid of him the quickest, like I definitely, like if I look back on that fight, I will remember that as somebody's probably like most realistic shot at beating Khabib. Like Dustin Poirier objectively lasted longer and probably landed more shots on Khabib, but it didn't have like the devastating threat that Justin Gaethje had. Like Gaethje has always said, I'm either gonna knock somebody out or get knocked out myself. And I mean, this time he got choked out, but it's the same thing. Like, it's just a really quick lit fuse, and it's either gonna work or it's not. And it almost did. Like, it's hard to say because that was one of the most dominant performances by Khabib throughout the whole fight. But intermixed in there were legitimate threats from Justin Gaethje. So, yeah, it's weird. It was probably Khabib's biggest threat. Like, not even the buildup. Like, the actual fight was probably Khabib's biggest threat to losing, and one of his easiest fights. It's really weird.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that Gaethje had going for him is he realistically laid out a way that he could beat Khabib that was realistic and that people could see happening, right? Like you talked about, maybe Poirier landed more shots, but Poirier's ability to go out and win, I would assume would be a submission or, just a dogfight. I don't think you're going to win in a dogfight versus Khabib, and I don't think a submission was realistic as far as Poirier's, I mean, he had the guillotine almost locked in, but, one other thing that I heard about, I don't know if Dana said in his the post press interview, but Dana said that Khabib was in the hospital 2 weeks ago with a broken bone in his foot and 2 broken toes, which if that is true, I mean,
I
Unbelievable.
saw he had 2 toes taped up, and so I would obviously it wasn't like, this sounds terrible. Obviously, it wasn't so broken that he still couldn't fight to a very high level. But especially fighting a guy like Justin Gaethje, like that sucks. Like you cannot reliably go into fights with broken feet and probably come out winning. So that's him.
And I take Khabib at his word. I do believe that, unlike a lot of these other people, Conor McGregor first comes to mind. When he says he's retired, I do believe that he will never step into the octagon anymore. I would still be interested in a fight for 30-0 against George St. Pierre, but I do not believe that that's happening anymore. I really think that Khabib thought long and hard about retiring. I think this was not an emotional decision that was made in the cage last night. I think it was really something that was thought through and planned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another thing too, how you said like everybody kind of gets behind the hype train of the guy fighting Khabib. Mm-hmm. I think a little bit. I mean, that happens with every champion, but I think a little bit more of like how that applies to Khabib is, well, one, it's so long between when he fights, and I'm not saying like that's Khabib's fault with like the shutdown, his religion and restrictions on when during the year he can fight. Mm-hmm. Like it's really like realistically, you get to see Khabib once a year. And so there was one point in the Dustin Poirier fight when he wasn't significantly hurt, but everybody knows Khabib's not really a striker, and Poirier was able to, like at one point, if I remember correctly, he had him hurt, and Joe Rogan or whoever was commentating the fight was like, "Oh, he's hurt," and then obviously he ended up doing better. But when you think somebody like, obviously I think it gets played up how much of a disadvantage Khabib is in striking, mm-hmm. or has striking, but I don't think of Dustin Poirier as one of the most threatening strikers in the division. So when he can land a significant shot, and it's been a year since that guy's fought, and Justin Gaethje has gotten I think Justin Gaethje had warranted hype going into the fight.
Yeah.
It just didn't happen to be true. Like, I think giving the information, I think it was realistic to think he could have gotten him out of there.
Yeah. And that was why I think this was Khabib's most built up fight, as far as a technical aspect. Obviously the Conor Khabib fight was probably more hyped up as far as the more casual fans and people tuning in, but I think this one was the most interesting stylistically.
Yeah, and then I guess the last thing I'll say on Khabib, at first I was a little disappointed because I wanted him to get to 30-0 just for like OCD purposes, like it looks cleaner. But I think one of the beautiful things about his career is like it's not like a guy was so perfectly well-rounded that every time he fought, you knew he was going to win. Like Khabib had just enough of a striking disadvantage that every single fight was legitimately interesting. Like you didn't completely know what was going to happen. Like I think if Khabib fights those top guys like 10 more times, somebody's catching him during one of them. But the fact that he made it all the way to the top of the mountain, basically beating everybody except Tony Ferguson, who lost that opportunity. Mm-hmm. It's like it could have happened, but it didn't. And that is even more to the credit of Khabib that, he made it to the other end unscathed, even though there's legitimate threats along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously this would then be where we would interject and talk about now the state of the lightweight division when Khabib vacates. But again, like the last one, we'll save that for a video of its own. So looking forward to next week, I will say that there is not much to look forward to. As big of a fan as I am, as far as the hype behind these fights for next week, I am not super intrigued. We've got in the main event, we have Anderson Silva versus Uriah Hall. And it has been said by Anderson Silva that this will be his last one. He's like mid-40s now. Certainly one of the greatest of all time of the middleweight division and maybe ever in MMA. I do not believe that he is the greatest ever, but there is a strong argument to be made based on his resume and based on his defenses. But stylistically, if both of these guys were in their primes, I think they're both very dynamic strikers. I think Hall probably will have the edge on him just based on the youthfulness of Hall. And even truthfully, in the whole scheme of things, Uriah Hall is not super youthful.
Yeah.
Right, but compared to old man Silva, I believe that Anderson probably should have hung it up about 4 or 5 fights ago. But, here we are. It's 2 big names that a lot of people will relate to. And I wouldn't doubt that this fight will do very well as far as people tuning in, because Anderson Silva is a name that sticks out, with a lot of the old fans and a lot of people who maybe watch this podcast or, the casual fans that, know of Anderson Silva as this absolute god among men in the octagon.
Yeah, I think this is a free fight, correct? This is a fight night.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I'm a little more, like, I have absolutely no idea besides, I think I know one other fight on the card, but besides the main event, I have no idea who's on the card.
Mm-hmm.
But that's usually what I get with fight nights. Like, I'm not as involved besides, like top 10 ranked guys.
Yeah.
But I'm actually, like, just that matchup alone, I think a little more bought in than you, because I mean, obviously you prefer like a mega fight or like a top contender fight. Like I would take a number 4 versus number 5 ranked guy any day of the week over this fight, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that it's a fight night, like, I can get behind the kind of themed fight nights that the UFC has been able to put on. So like this reminds me of the fight night in Mexico City when it was like Jeremy Stevens versus Yair Rodriguez.
Yep.
Like, even though that ended up being a really disappointing fight because of an eye poke, the
Mm-hmm.
buildup was awesome, because even though they weren't necessarily super top contenders at the time, they had, videos of Yair like training up in like the ancient like ruins of, the Maya or Aztec civilization,
Yeah.
wherever he was at. So like that alone got me interested in the fight, just because there was like a theme behind it.
Yeah.
So this one, as dumb as a theme as it is, maybe the fact that it's the Spider Silva on Halloween, I'm like, okay, this is thematically relevant enough I can get behind it. And then on top of that, again, Uriah Hall has not been on the forefront of anybody's mind lately, but he is, if I were to like on a scale of 1 to 10 opponents that would be exciting to see Anderson Silva fight at this point in his career, Uriah Hall is definitely on the higher end of that spectrum, So
Yes.
I think it's like one of those weird themed fights where alone you might not be super excited to see one of their fights, but just given the circumstances, it's at least like I'll be excited to watch it.
Yeah. And I think this is a hot take that you may or may not agree with me. Based on who I think is going to win, maybe this isn't the logical decision, but I'm going to go with Anderson Silva. I think he goes out with a win over a respectable opponent, and I think ends his career in the minds of most, at least not on top, obviously, but on a good note.
Yeah. It's weird. Anderson Silva, the fighters are different in my mind. Like, Anderson Silva is definitely and I think he could very well win the fight. I think he is definitely on the decline since his prime, but within recent memory, he had a competitive fight with Izzy.
He took a round against Izzy. It was 2-1.
So Anderson Silva, if he's 80 years old, will still be able to do something cool and win a fight. So that's always exciting. And then really, I'm, as much as I'm not qualified to talk about anything, I'm really not qualified to talk about Uriah Hall, because for better or worse, Uriah Hall is a guy that will almost always, or at least right now, he's like timeless in my mind, in that I have no idea how well he's been doing lately, but I'll always remember his highlights from like the Ultimate Fighter and the old UFC days. So when I think of Uriah Hall, I just think of somebody that's dangerous, but I have no idea how he'll stack up against an old Anderson Silva. Like, it's truly just awesome in my mind.
In recent memory, if I can remember correctly, he had a loss to Costa that was, I think, a pretty dominant loss. I think Costa beat him pretty bad. And then he won, and then he was slated to fight Yoel Romero. They were supposed to be matched up, and then something happened with Romero, and that is why Silva was plugged into this. So, I mean, based on where he's at, and if he was slated to fight Yoel, I mean, he's at least solidified that he is among the upper echelon of fighters, but not quite in that upper echelon. I think that was definitely a fight for Yoel to win and then get himself right back in the talks.
Yeah, he is ranked 10th, I believe, right now. If I saw on like the promo last night. Another angle, I think this might be a slightly interesting fight, is that it's for sure the last fight of Silva's career, so it's his retirement. And given the fact that Uriah Hall is just supposed to fight Yoel Romero, this might be a little bit of a bold claim. But given the fact that he's 36 years old and ranked 10th, like, for more or less, this might be the symbolic retirement of Uriah Hall if he were to lose. Like, even though Anderson Silva isn't ranked, I think if Uriah Hall wins this, he for sure has like a top 8 ranked opponent next.
Yes.
And that could possibly string together his last shot at a title run. So while he's not going to retire if he loses this fight, this might be his last legitimate line to a title shot, even though that is far-fetched.
Yeah.
Like, this might be his shot to make something of a title run.
Yeah, absolutely. That is, another feather in your cap of, an all-time great, regardless of when you beat them. A win over Anderson Silva is certainly worth something.
Yeah, like, especially right now, like, any name you can get hype over could give you a legitimate shot to the title. Like, they're talking about Khamzat Chimaev possibly getting a title shot if he wins his next fight against Leon Edwards.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure he's fought a ranked opponent yet.
He has not. He is yet to fight a ranked opponent.
So while he might be that good, after beating no ranked, Anderson Silva is unranked, but has a huge name. Khamzat Chimaev has fought 3 unranked guys with, in the grand scheme of things, no name, and he's 1 fight away from a title shot. So
I know.
Anything is possible.
It's crazy. Looking at some of the other fights of note on the main card, we have Andre Fili versus Bryce Mitchell. Truthfully, the casual in me, I don't quite know much about Andre Fili, and I didn't do a whole bunch of research. Cal is usually my research guy, and like we said earlier, he is unable to do it. But I do know a lot about Bryce Mitchell. He is a grappler. Is very fun to watch as far as his transitions on the mat. He's known for his twister. He's got 2 maybe he only has 1 twister finish, but in his last fight, he had his opponent wrapped up in like 2 twisters and was unable to finish. But his grappling is among the most dynamic in not only the division, but in the entire UFC. And he's also this redneck. He's a hick. I'm hoping that Reebok gets him his camo shorts. I know that was one thing that he said in his post-fight interview last time. And they said that they were going to get him his camo shorts. So that would be cool for me if he came out in camo shorts. And then also there is a heavyweight bout between Greg Hardy and Maurice Green. Maurice Green is definitely not one of those top heavyweights, and I wouldn't even put him as even close to a top heavyweight. But Greg Hardy is a name that a lot of people have heard, and a win for Greg Hardy over Maurice Green would at least propel him into a decent fight of, somebody a little bit more recognizable than Maurice Green. So, And in the prelims, there is really nothing notable. That does not mean that there aren't going to be bangers of fights on this card, right? That just means that there are no matchups right away that hype up based on the names. We've seen of late, some of the best fight nights have been, or nights of fighting have been these fight nights that have, nobody's fighting nobodies, and they're awesome fights. So,
yeah, the other fight besides the main event that interests me most on that card is definitely Mitchell versus Fili.
Yep.
And there's Fili. If I'm saying his name right, Fili or Philly.
I don't know. We're casuals. Who knows?
Fili is like one of those blank spots. I think I have a lot of them, but you don't realize you have the blank spots until they're a main or co-main event. Because like Fili, just from being around the sport for years, like I recognize his name, and if I saw his name on a card, I'd be excited to watch it. And yet I cannot remember a single fight that he's ever had. Yeah. So over time, I definitely have respect for him. Like I've gotten the rub that he's a tough dude. I just can't remember. I think he lost his last fight, but I can't remember who against. And then Bryce Mitchell, I think I've seen 2 or 3 of his fights, and he just reminds me of like a guy who looks pretty unassuming in a college wrestling room, but would ride the crap out of you and just make you want to quit. So I got a lot of respect for him. It doesn't look like he has the ground and pound of Khabib, but his like grappling presence reminds me of Khabib in a different way.
Yeah. But yeah, certainly fights that are interesting, but not that I am going to pretend are hyped beyond belief. As far as fight nights go, the actual matchups of this I would rank pretty low. But yeah, outside of really the recap and the preview for next week's card, this is really all we've got for this this episode of the podcast. Now, this podcast will obviously go up on our podcasting hosting service, which means you'll be able to listen to it on Apple Podcasts. You'll be able to listen to it on Spotify. It's still undecided if we're going to put this one on YouTube because, like I said, we're going to be testing out a few new video formats as far as our YouTube is concerned. What I've been finding is that our podcast is to the point in its growth where we are getting some feedback from people who listen, and I think it's pretty tough to watch a YouTube video that's, upwards of 45 to an hour long and still stay interested. I think we may have a little bit more success in having certain videos that are targeted at one specific concept that may be, 5 to 10 minutes long, maybe a little bit longer, but try to hold that interest of you guys a little bit more rather than listening to, like I said, a 45-minute show in which you only want to hear about, the Andre Philly versus Bryce Mitchell fight, right? You don't have to sift through all that stuff. So with that being said, that will wrap up our episode of the podcast for this week. And then please, it helps us a lot if you subscribe to us on YouTube. If you like our videos, if you leave comments, the feedback really helps. And if you are listening to the podcast version, keep listening. And I see that Nolan has put his background of our friend Trace, who we said last weekend had his first pro debut. Everybody only has one pro debut, but he got a submission within the first minute and will probably be climbing the ranks, not only of the Cage Aggression promotion, but to higher promotions in the future.
Yep. Thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure to share my opinion.
Yeah. And thanks for coming on.
Yep. No problem.